Okay, so welcome to the public webinar series at Tokyo College, which is an institute for advanced study at the University of Tokyo. My name is Naoko Shimazu, and I'm a global historian and professor at Tokyo College. I'll be moderating the webinar today. So now allow me to introduce today's panelists. Our speaker is Professor Christina GARSTEN, who is principal of the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study, known as SCAS, and also professor of social anthropology at the universities of Uppsala and Stockholm. Professor GARSTEN is the current president of the Network of European Institutes for Advanced Study, known as NETIAS. She has held numerous positions around the world, including Stanford, LSE, EHESS, EUI, for example. And she's as I said, social anthropologist with expertise in organizational anthropology, researching organizational culture and its transnational dynamics, among other things. So her publications are too many to mention, so I'm just going to flag up the one which came out recently, Discrete Power, How the World Economic Forum Shapes Global Markets, which you co-authored with Adrian Surbum and it's out from the Stanford University Press. So today she's visiting Tokyo College as a distinguished Tokyo College professor. So we're delighted to have you here, Professor GARSTEN. To comment, we have Professor John Lee, who is Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. He has worked extensively in social theory, political economy, and East Asia. Professor Lee is a prolific author as well, and we await with much eagerness his forthcoming book on the global environmental crisis, Science, Worldview, and Inaction, from the University of California Press. We've been fortunate to have Professor Lee in 2023 as Tokyo College professor, and are very pleased to have him back with us as Tokyo College professor till December this year. So welcome, John. Before we start, I'd just like to draw your attention to the availability of simultaneous translation. Please click the translation button at the bottom of the screen, and in order to switch to Japanese or English. Today's session is conducted in English, so if you click the button, it will switch to Japanese interpretation. Now, for the Q&A session, please post your questions or comments in English or Japanese in the chat box on the screen. Now, I have to apologize in advance today because we have to end this webinar earlier than the usual full 1 hour, 30 minutes due to an earthquake drill that's going to happen exactly at 12 noon. So we'll finish 5 minutes before or something like that. So today, Professor GARSTEN will speak on transnational think tanks, and the title of the talk is Fashioning Futures, Seeing, Knowing, and Governing the Not Yet. The title is slightly different from the one that's advertised in the poster, but the content, I'm sure, will be on this transnational think tanks and what we ought to think about them. So without further ado, I shall pass the floor to you, Professor GARSTEN.
Thank you very much, Professor Shimazu, and also for that generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here at Tokyo College, indeed honored to have this privilege to talk here. And I'm also glad to specifically have been invited to talk about the making of futures in think tanks. I will now share my screen. And I will do so based on research that I have been doing over the past 10 years on think tanks in the United States and Europe. And at the focus of my research is what kind of knowledge that is created in think tanks, how they go about using this knowledge to influence policymakers and politicians, and then how they conceptualize the future and try to work towards shaping it. And this research has been undertaken in the project Global Foresight, funded by the Bank of Sweden Tricentenary Foundation. And my focus thus is set on anticipation, that is, on the envisioning of a future event or state in the present. And here you see the research team, once we started the project up at a meeting in New York at New York University, gathering ideas for how to move ahead. So as we have seen over the past few decades, with intensified and multiple crises, conflicts, and uncertainty, there is a growing interest in the future. And more specifically, a growing interest in attempting to see, to know, and also thus govern the future. Scholars such as sociologist Hartmut Rosa and social anthropologist Thomas Hylland Erikson, respectively, talk about our times as times of acceleration or times of overheating. And according to Rosa, in his book Acceleration from 2015, both the structural and cultural aspects of our institutions and practices are marked by what he calls the shrinking of the present, a decreasing time period during which expectations based on past experience reliably match the future. And when this combines with technological acceleration and the increasing pace of life, time seems to flow even faster, making our relationships to each other and to the world fluid and problematic. It is as if we are standing on what he calls slippery slopes, a steep social terrain that in itself is in motion and in turn demands faster lives and technology. And as Rosa deftly shows, this self-reinforcing feedback loop fundamentally determines the character of modern life. And to Hylland Erikson, as explained in his book Overheating from 2016, overheating is a metaphor for the accelerated changes we see on a global level, creating crises for the climate, the economy, and our identity, as well as putting not only biological, but also cultural diversity under pressure. And in this context, anticipatory action, that is, foreseeing, foreshadowing, or forecasting future events, has gained increased currency as a way to engage with far-reaching societal changes, such as the Anthropocene, climate change, biopolitics, and securitization. And anticipation involves the envisioning of a future event or state in the present. And this is both a prevalent organizational activity and a fundamental societal aspiration about governing social, economic, and political affairs. States, business organizations, and civil society organizations find knowledge about the future to be indispensable for a number of purposes. Individuals, too, search for ways of apprehending the not yet, to be prepared, as it were. Anticipatory knowledge is used to mobilize support for policy proposals, to ground strategies and decision-making in reasonable levels of facticity and predictability, and to project the appearance of professional credibility and competence in a world of contingencies. Anticipation can thus be seen as a kind of prospective sense-making, an attempt to make sense of what the future may bring. Carl Weick used this notion to refer to future-oriented sense-making, making sense of what may be, and to learn how to work towards realization of a desired future. And in much work on anticipation, knowledge about the future is treated as neutral and unproblematic. Yet, as we know, knowledge is tightly related to power and to governance. So anticipation, I propose, speaks not only to the sense-making involved in looking towards the future, but to the distribution of agency and influence. Anticipation is imbricated with the plurality of power relations that make up contemporary liberal democracies. And as Ben Anderson suggests, anticipatory action is a key means through which life in contemporary liberal democracies is secured, conducted, disciplined, and normalized. Still, the ways in which organizations engage in anticipation in actual practice have not been sufficiently conceptualized in research. This picture, by the way, is a stylized picture of Tiresias, the blind seer in Greek mythology, who possessed the gift of foresight. So over the past few decades, we have seen an immense proliferation of new think tanks arise, new kids on the block, as it were. Think tanks have assumed an enhanced presence in global and national politics over the past few decades. They have increased in sheer numbers, in resources, and in the number of professionals employed. And in the US, the numbers doubled after 1980, now being about 1,800 or more, and also growing in other parts of the world. Think tanks are spreading globally, also by way of setting up satellite organizations to be present in different corners of the world. And this is a crowded scene with intense competition for ideas, with actors struggling for attention on the media scene. Now, think tanks, broadly defined as research policy institutes, have, since the 1920s, when they first began to emerge, been growing in numbers, originally created with the aim to help government think. They provide knowledge, information, and propositions to decision makers in politics and business. And most think tanks of some influence now have their own indexes. For example, the State of the Future Index, the Freedom Index, and indexes like that. Definitions of what constitutes a think tank abound, but there is very little consensus around it. We may, however, conceive of them as organizations geared to produce knowledge of a particular kind, actionable knowledge, knowledge that can be put into practice by policymakers, business leaders, and politicians. The World Economic Forum is a particularly interesting case in point here. For several years, me and my colleague Adrienne Serbohm have done fieldwork at the World Economic Forum and in their meetings across the world, in Davos and elsewhere. The World Economic Forum was created in 1972 by Karl Schwab, and its motto is improving the state of the world. Their signature event in Davos in Switzerland is where world leaders meet. The meeting brings a select group of people, partners, and invitees, carefully vetted and selected, to take part in this meeting and work on assessing threats and opportunities to the world and what to do about them. The World Economic Forum has no formal mandate to make decisions that have impact on world affairs. They are not a representative organization like the United Nations, and thus cannot speak on behalf of states. They enjoy what we call a liquid mandate, dependent on the support of their partner organizations, that is, business corporations. They exercise a soft, indirect form of power, speaking with Joseph Nye, what we call discrete power. The World Economic Forum works to set agendas and priorities for large-scale organizations, for transnational business organizations, states, and international non-governmental organizations. But they have no sanctions at their disposal. They operate by way of attraction and seduction. And this is important since it may have geopolitical implications. The interplay of transparency and opacity is constitutive of the organization. It builds on an image of openness, accessibility, and public engagement, as evinced also in its architectural design, here seen on a photo from inside the headquarters in Geneva. And by promising status and rich market and policy opportunities for its funders and its invitees, it succeeds in attracting people and organizations to covet participation in Davos and other places. But the organization also promises the provision of safe places, trust, and discretion. As one of the top-level directors said in an interview, "We have the privilege of being private." Key to its attraction is the provision of a discretionary and safe space, secluded and secure, based on the choices of the forum and the discretion of the participants. And these participants, on the other hand, endow the forum with status, prestige, and agency. The World Economic Forum claims to be a shy organization, which is intended to reveal the care that is taken to shield themselves off from unwanted media attention and from uninvited guests. The World Economic Forum aims to attract the best brains of the world. Leading experts from across business, academia, government, civil society, and media gather each year in October or November in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, for the World Economic Forum's annual meeting of the Global Future Councils. You see one of these meeting sessions on the photo here. At this meeting, some 400 to 500 attendees from more than 80 countries discuss and debate opportunities for future advancements and the numerous issues that continue to hamper economic growth and human development. And this network of global future councils is one of the world's foremost multi-stakeholder and interdisciplinary knowledge networks dedicated to exploring a more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable future. The network's 30 councils focus on topics such as job creation, cybersecurity, international trade, climate, and food and water security, among others. And there are 3 core tenets to the network of global future councils. Fresh idea and innovative thinking. This means nurturing cutting-edge and disruptive ideas and developing the foresight to identify and shape key areas. And secondly, the grounding in expertise and evidence. That is, providing a foundation for data, evidence, fact, and research-based public-private cooperation. And thirdly, interdisciplinary and systems approach, meaning connecting the dots between established and frontier issues and integrating thought leaders from business, academia, civil society, government, and international organizations. And the Council's ideas are also publicly disseminated through a forecast report in October each year, building momentum of the annual meeting of the Global Future Councils. And selected councils are invited to join the forecast dialogue series, comprising live-streamed cross-council exchanges. So participants in these meetings are thus part of a community that aspires to shape the future. And we may be reminded here of the anthropologist Arjun Appadurai's writings on aspiration, in which he claims that the capacity to anticipate the future is differentially distributed, and that this capacity thus differentiates those with potential influence and power from those whose capacity to aspire has not yet been provided. At the Global Future Council meetings, a certain capacity to aspire and to anticipate is built among those who are invited to participate. And as part of our research, we did a number of interviews in relation to the forum's flagship report, the Global Risks Report. This yearly report presents a number of risks and potential scenarios for the coming years. It is based on the perceptions of a number of people from the World Economic Forum network, the so-called expert network. In the process of making this report, what constitutes a risk is negotiated, and eventually a large number of potential risks are trimmed down to a reasonable number, thus resulting in this report. And this report is then used and referred to by a number of governments, international organizations, and NGOs as a robust source of information about plausible future risks. So, from a critical governance perspective, we can see that a focus on anticipation, as it is pursued in think tanks, may shed light on how notions of seeing the future, thus knowing the future, also provides opportunities for intervening in the future, for shaping and governing future affairs. And there is a clear relation between visibility, knowledge, and governance. So the question then becomes, how do they go about this? What are the resources and tools? And what type of knowledge is created? Let's look at how the future is worked upon by another think tank studied by our research group, and mostly so by my colleague Adrienne Serbon. The Millennium Project, a US-based think tank, is engaged in providing so-called global intelligence for future foresight. The Millennium Project aims to assist in organizing futures research, improve thinking about the future, and make that thinking available through a variety of media for consideration in policymaking, in advanced training, public education, and feedback, ideally in order to accumulate wisdom about potential futures. The Millennium Project's diversity of opinions and global views is ensured by its 63 so-called nodes around the world. And these are groups of individuals and organizations that interconnect global and local perspectives. They identify participants, conduct interviews, translate and distribute questionnaires, and conduct research and conferences. And it is through their contributions that the report State of the Future, and indeed all of the Millennium Project's work, emerges. The State of the Future Index is an indication of the 10-year outlook for the future based on 20 years of historical data for a selected group of variables that in combination can depict potential systemic change. It is constructed with key indicators that are individually forecasted and then aggregated to indicate the potential direction and intensity of change. It shows a potential trend. It is not a projection. Its role is to help understand the system and the relationships among its items, how changes to individual or several variables ripple throughout the system. As an example, the Millennium Project warns about the threats of advanced technologies to employment. A growing body of AI experts believes that if socio-political economic systems stay the same and technological acceleration, integration, and globalization continue, then half of the world could be unemployed by the year 2050. That's one of their forecasts. To address this grand challenge, the Millennium Project has launched a Future Work Technology 2050 study with 8 steps involving literature and related research review, roadmaps and scenario drafts, policy implications, national planning workshops, and public discussion. And to create a sense of urgency and acuteness, the organization works to make its readers imagine what a world in which half of the population would be unemployed would look and feel like. Propelled by the unease and worry that such imaginations may stir, the think tank then mobilizes select groups of experts through planning workshops and scenario drafts intended for policy implementation. Organizations have also taken this one step further in educating for what they call future readiness. And there are now multiple classes, courses available for leaders to enroll. This opportunity comes, however, with a cost, which is often substantial for the participant. The rationale for this is clear, as stated by the Millennium Project, and here I quote, "Decision makers are rarely trained in foresight and decision making, even though decision support and foresight systems are constantly improving, for example, by big data analytics, simulations, collective intelligence systems, indexes, and e-governance participatory systems." End quote. So decision makers and their advisors should be trained in futures research for optimal use of these systems, it is assumed. Government leaders would thus be well advised not just to request foresight reports and briefings from futurists, but also to periodically discuss long-range issues with leading futurists. Not only think tanks are engaged in educating for preparedness, but so are other organizations. Another example from our study is by an international organization, hence not a think tank, the UNESCO, that has created a large-scale project on what they call futures literacy. As a UNESCO program, it seeks to improve connections between knowledge and action in order to achieve positive changes. And the starting point for the Futures Literacy Program is the idea that humanity constantly handles and prepares for the future based on what the program terms anticipatory assumptions, which are the most basic components of anticipatory activities as they underlie all imaginations of the future. Different anticipatory assumptions generate different so-called imaginaries, and not just existing futures, which includes different kinds of future. For the most part, these assumptions are taken for granted and not reflected upon. As claimed by Real Miller in a report issued by UNESCO in 2018, people at large are futures illiterate. And by introducing the technique of experimenting in so-called futures laboratories, humanity will have the power of futures literacy to overcome the poverty of their imagination and develop new sources for the invention of hope as an essential ingredient of peace, Miller writes. In the world of futures literacy, no impeding structures are seen to exist. Futures literate individuals and organizations are programmatically free and able to pursue any dreams and visions they may have, seemingly without the restraint of political, cultural, and economic barriers. The program is not merely a compelling case of contemporary forms of governing, but a political project with potentially enduring consequences and a telling example of how the UNESCO as an organization attempts to gain influence within and beyond the UN system, governing anticipation, as it were. And as part of our research, we have done participant observation in futures literacy training in various organizations and in a number of places across the world, in the UNESCO, in the EU, in a diversity of think tanks. Deployed by large-scale organizations such as the UNESCO, futures literacy training directs attention to the powerful forces that shape our futures, the need to learn about what signals and influences to be observant of, and thus learning to be agile and responsive in relation to the diversity of plausible scenarios. Futures literacy is thus conceived by and large as a matter of reducing uncertainty and attuning one's capacities in a proactive manner. As I mentioned, a related concept that also flourishes is that of future readiness. To be ready, to be prepared, may be seen as a signature of late modernity, of late capitalism. The anthropologist Andrew Lakoff, for example, has written on the logic of preparedness in his book Unprepared from 2017. And with Lakoff, we can say that preparedness succeeds even when it fails, insofar as the response to a perceived failure is not to question whether preparedness was the right approach, but rather to invest in extending its reach further. More exercises, more vulnerability assessments, improved early warning systems, and so on. On the pictures here, you can see people engaged in group exercises on future preparedness using, as was often the case, post-it notes and creative movements as a means to think out of the box. Ways to conceive of the future may build on the use of metrics, indexes, linear projections, big data analytics, creative group sessions, as well as on more phantasmagoric exercises aimed at freeing one's imagination and fantasy. In June 2018, the California-based think tank Institute for the Future announced on its website that its institute first ever magician in residence will inject even more wonder into futures thinking. Institute for the Future, we read, has partnered with magic experience designer, author, and organizational consultant Ferdinando Buscema as the Institute's first ever magician in residence. Buscema and the Institute for the Future will co-develop events, corporate workshops, and research at the intersection of technology, organizational strategy, and magic to spark the imagination. Now, for decades, Institute for the Future has used strategic foresight to instill a sense of awe and hope that inspires audiences to make their desired future a reality. And based in Milan, Italy, Buscema takes a similar approach to his work with senior leaders at global companies and organizations. And I quote from the website, "Magic provides audiences an opportunity to playfully challenge the very notion of what's possible, fueling curiosity and renewing people's sense of wonder about the world," says Buscema, an internationally acclaimed conjurer and sleight of hand artist who performs regularly at the prestigious Magic Castle in Hollywood. Institute for the Future will meld its time-tested methodologies for futures thinking with Buscema's magic experience design to help organizations and the public think systematically about the future in astonishing new ways and ultimately make better decisions in the present, end quote. This quote makes visible the importance of hope and positivity, indeed magic, in future-oriented think tanks. The conjuring of hope is yet another way by which such organizations try to offer possible ways forward, moving the globe away from the dangers and risks of environmental disasters, weak state formations, massive unemployment, or other types of systemic breakdowns. The quote also captures a sense of agency and empowerment that is often underscored by think tanks and consultancies geared to designing the future. And with political scientist Dominique Moissy, we may think here of the geopolitics of emotion. Dominique Moissy, who coined and elaborated on the term, sees three emotions: fear, humiliation, and hope, as shaping the contemporary world. Emotions matter as he say, they impact on the attitudes of peoples, the relationships between cultures, and the behavior of nations. In the voicing of global problems and the presentation of desirable futures, the cultivation, articulation, and management of fear, anxiety, and hope, as well as reliance on rationality, reason, and evidence, are all central components. And we participated, as I mentioned, in a couple of such courses meant to free the imagination of participants. And here is an example of the creative works that may emanate from such group sessions. Expressions such as future readiness and futures literacy suggest that there are ways to understand and manage the openness of the future, and that both individual and organizational actors may learn how to do this. to some extent then orienting towards the future, apprehending risks and opportunities, and articulating ways of dealing with these are capabilities that can be learned. It also implies that actors may organize themselves to develop and expand these kinds of capabilities. But the notion tends to focus on the role and position of the individual, and less so on structure and on conditions for action. It tends to favor attention on the individual actor and his or her agentic capacities, rather than examine closely the structures of distributed agency and the processes of structuration involved. According to sociologists Meyer and Jefferson, the cultivation of this individual agentic capacity is one of the great myths of our times. You see here the certificate that I got after attending one of these courses in future readiness. So the scenarios developed by think tanks and similar types of organizations may be said to work as models not only of the world, but also for the world, in anthropologist Clifford Geertz's wordings. As models of the world, they serve as tools for ordering the world and as a device for the structuring of thoughts and actions. And through these accounts, the organizations involved define challenges and problems, direct attention to particular issues for reflection, and give future direction for thought and action. Such accounts serve to position and reposition the organization in a desirable context of values and actions. As models of the world, the scenarios and the processes of making them may reflect a need to understand present-day situations and the role of organizations in it. As the world is undergoing rapid change and in many ways our forms of life are urgently threatened, scenario making may provide a way to grasp and give meaning to the situation. But we can also see these acts, that is scenario making, as more than models of the world, namely a modeling for the future. And Geertz again would call this a production of model for the future. Models for the future may become performative. Performativity is the power of our language to effect change in the world. Language and images do not simply describe the world, but may instead and also function as a form of social action. Scenario making is about making use of both model of and models for the present and future, moving to and fro between these, as it were. They may have a performative effect on our world. The role that the future industry has taken upon itself is thus to present models for the future as well as of the future. And activities such as workshops and courses and the models they present are at the core of the future industry. Scenarios for the future are also projections of possibility, of hope and desire. They make visible the horizons of expectation in Koselleck's terms. And with Ian hacking, we can also see how they may provide a feedback loop of knowledge production, thus also producing self-fulfilling prophecies and have looping effects. There are asymmetries of access to imagination, anticipation, and future making. And the opportunities sketched here in terms of classes, courses, meetings, etc., are not open to everyone. We may venture to think of emerging aspiring transnational elites of future making, a world in which some actors are better equipped with resources to aspire and to be future ready than others. Future foresight comes across as an assemblage of power negotiations, viewed in this way. Anticipation revolves around knowledge production, claims to knowledge, the forms of knowledge that are created, and the way these are represented and anticipatory practices do have implications for the kind of power and governance at play. Organizational practices involved in such efforts are thus far from simple number crunching exercises, data visualizations, mere stories, or simply fiction. They may have an impact on how certain images of the future are not only created, but made to stick, as it were, and thus influence decision-making, strategy, policy-making, and long-term planning. By way of concluding, I have aimed to show how in the work of think tanks and other organizations, imaginings of possible, potential, and desirable futures may lay the ground for governing organizational processes. And these processes are instances by which phenomena, problems, and opportunities imagined in the future are made visible, legible, and possible to act on. And deploying the concept of anticipatory governance may shed light on the various ways in which knowledge claims about possible and future and plausible futures are brought to bear on the governance of contemporary organizations and individual human beings. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor GARSTEN, for a very insightful and thought-provoking presentation. And we do have, Tokyo University has its own Futures Institute. So it may be a very interesting case study to add to your example. So now we turn to Professor Lee for his comments. So.
Well, thank you, Professor GARSTEN, for a wonderful lecture. Let me first praise her. I mean, she has done wonderful studies of organizational dynamics, like her early work on Apple. And this is really quite innovative and important for her field of social anthropology. For better or worse, social anthropologists have tended to study the past, as it were, studying what we used to call tribal societies. And she brings the craft, methods, and insight of social and cultural anthropology to bear on the present and some of the most important actors, if you will, organizations in presence. There's also a wonderful element of where sociologists and social anthropologists in the past had tended to study down, meaning people who are relatively powerless, as non-industrial people were. And for a while, social anthropologists were studying themselves, but she is at the forefront of anthropologists who are studying up, people who are capable more than others of shaping the future, powerful people in short. And I especially appreciate her latest effort to study the future. The great anthropologist Lévi-Strauss said there are topics which are good to think with, bon à penser. I mean, he was thinking mainly of food and sex, cultural universals, but there's nothing more, I think, useful to think about than the future, because, like it or not, it's coming. I can go on praising her, but I will try to channel my inner negativity by raising some questions, not criticisms, but questions I have. First, it's a purely an epistemic point. I came of age as a social scientist, and futurology was at its height way back in the 1970s. One of my teachers was Daniel Bell, a great futurologist himself. And one of the tragedies of the first generation of futurology, of course, was that they were almost, not completely, but mainly wrong. And I think one of the reasons why that is so is that they failed to take seriously the fundamental epistemic distinction between risk and uncertainty. I mean, risks are things that we know about. Uncertainty is something we just don't know anything about. And what do we study? We study risk because that's what we know about, rather than things that may be coming that are not as obvious, but maybe more important. And as an example, and this is actually not about risk and uncertainty, but the sheer difficulty, I think, of futurology or future studies is, let's think about the recent event, if you can call it that, that upended our way of life, namely the pandemic. I know we don't want to think about it, but it did happen. It will happen again. There's a great study supposedly done called the Global Health Security Index that came out in 2019. It essentially ranked 200 nation states by their level of preparedness for a future pandemic. the most prepared country, according to the expert, was the United States, followed closely by the United Kingdom. Now, it depends in part on when you take, what historical point you take, when things are going well. But for much of the pandemic, in many ways, the country that seemed to fare the worst were United States and United Kingdom. And it's not a blanket criticism of future studies, but that people tend to mitigate and underemphasize really important factors that are not easily measurable, such as, for example, politics. It's not an accident that so-called populist presidents or leaders, I won't name names, were at the helm and probably didn't contribute to a rightful response to the threat of pandemic. The next point I would like to raise is one of, so I am kind of obsessed with the future, mainly because it's coming, is that people who study future tend to forget about the past. They study the recent past because that's what we can go on, the present, as it were. And one of the interesting things, it seems to me, about future studies is that we don't learn lessons of history. We have a global historian here. We have many lessons of history. We know what some of the dynamics that lead to World War are. We know some of the dynamics that lead to the decline of empires. But for whatever reason, these knowledge, if you will, that are extremely concrete are never deployed, employed, and discussed seriously as we anticipate the future, because we think that it will be radically different. It may be, maybe not, I don't know. So one of the key lessons of history may be that we don't learn from history. Which also leads to my next point, which is not, again, it's not a criticism of Professor GARSTEN's lecture. It's about thinking about the state of future studies, which is that it's remarkable to me how ineffective we are, even when we know how tremendous risk that we live under. Professor GARSTEN makes climate change. There's an absolute consensus among climate scientists. We know it's not good. And in fact, if you read up on the literature, we know it's really terrible. There are, of course, hired hands by coal industry, petroleum industry who say otherwise. But most legitimate scientists completely agree on at least global warming and the deleterious consequence that will stem from it. We suffer from it already. But what do? Very little, if anything. Let me give you another example, which you might think would be easier to deal with. Japan is, since we're in Japan, has been worried about declining population, aging population. And what's remarkable to me is that government reports on this very danger were first published sometime like 45 to 50 years ago. Demographers knew what was coming. It's been obvious. For 50 years, or 40 years, or 30 years, certainly, people are aware. But what has been done? Almost nothing. Nothing that has had any impact. And so one of the points I take from this is not the irrelevance of future studies, but rather that something is missing. That the temptation is always to go for the lowest hanging fruits. We make fun of people on the Titanic, which was sinking, everyone knew it was sinking, who were shuffling deck chairs as the ship was sinking. We make fun of them. But if I can be empathetic in this anthropological, ethnographic way, what could they do? That's the only thing they could do. And in many ways, what we find government officials, transnational intellectuals, policy professionals, and even academics do is not to think and try to act on things that may make a difference, but to do things that are relatively easy.
Mm.
So we recycle when we know it. For a long time, recycled materials were just sent to China until China stopped taking it. And so we now have a problem. And the final point, again, I raised not as a criticism, but something I worry about, and I seem to be one of the few who worry about it.
Mm.
So we take something like climate change, which is a game changer, which is extremely serious in its consequences, and we feel it every day, everywhere. There are no countries that I know of that take it seriously enough to plan for it, except for one, which is China. China has actually plans for what will happen when the ocean rises up. China has plans. I mean, it may not work, who knows? But at least they're planning, which raises an extremely disturbing question for me, that it's the authoritarian, technocratic governments that seem capable of doing something substantive, whereas the so-called advanced industrial democracies, which we live under and which we seem to like by and large, seem so impotent. So again, I like to close by thanking Professor GARSTEN for a wonderful paper, thought-provoking, and I can only hope for more Professor GARSTEN. We can clone her, and we have 100 people like her. The world will be much better off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee, for those very insightful and thoughtful reflections. There are lots to pick up on here, and I'll pick up on a few things, and I hope we can continue the discussion whilst I'm here and beyond my visit to Tokyo College. Yes, you're right. Something is missing. And one may wonder, why do we insist on picking the lowest hanging fruits, engaging in group sessions and seminars and exercises when we probably realize it's relatively futile in the long term? I don't know who has an answer to this. But as an anthropologist, perhaps I could think in terms of the strength of old habits. Humans tend to go by routine, but by what we know from before, even if it doesn't help us to do so. We have very strong routines and habits and traditions and cultures, and in this context, epistemic cultures, policy cultures, bureaucratic ways of doing things that I think will need to be questioned and radically challenged in order for us to attempt to conceive of climate change and how we could or have to deal with it. Same goes for the pandemic. So I think what we're doing is underutilizing our resources. I mean, we have a lot of technological and also knowledge type resources that we are putting to use in, if you excuse me, relatively banal contexts. So I think that established ways of thinking and doing things, whether it be in families or in neighborhoods or corporations or bureaucracy, are one main factor. We need to attempt to break up those. And this may get me to the point that you made, or the question you raised about the slowness of democratically constituted societies relative to authoritarian societies, which is a very worrying point, where you might see that authoritarianism has one thing going for it, which is the capacity for swift and radical decisions. And I think here, being a strong believer in representative democracy, we need to shape democracy up to deal with these challenges. We need perhaps to intervene in terms of climate change by stricter legislation and more radical decisions that we will have to adapt to as individuals and corporate structures. So I think democracy or our everyone who works, and indeed every citizen, needs to think about how we can kind of reinvigorate our democratic structures and indeed procedures to do things a bit faster and a bit differently. And here, I think the two empirical cases of the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, the UNESCO, may be illustrative. I don't want to give World Economic Forum the claim for actually doing a lot of good stuff in relation to climate change, but I want to give them the praise for actually trying to move faster by inviting leaders of all kinds, different kinds of organizations to discuss and see what they can actually accelerate at home in their organizations. It's a faster way than the representative way of the United Nations, which is a very slow organization, I regret to say, although I'm a strong believer in it and the way it's structured, but we do have problems there. Another point you raise is that forecasts tend to be wrong. Indeed, they are, and we know meteorologist? No, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And economists, as well as health professionals, tend to be wrong when forecasting the weather, the financial state of countries, and the outbreak of pandemics. And I think this is something we have to live with. And perhaps we do need these forecasts in order to somehow make sense of what it is that we are up to, and to provide some direction to our policy proposals and our yearly plans and our everyday plans at a more local, narrow level. So that's what we have. And hopefully we can only get better, hopefully with new technology as well, and new routines, as I mentioned, to make them more robust and reliable. And the difficulty that you mentioned is that the future or what may happen in the future cannot be measured. It cannot, by definition, be foreseen. So we have to live with this uncertainty in the midst of all the risks that we also have to bear. So the how should I say, the great challenge of not being able to measure and to anticipate is something that we human beings have to just live by. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Professor Lee, would you have anything to respond to?
So I have
Christina's?
I would be curious what Professor GARSTEN thinks. So if I may pose a question. So one of the fundamental forces in contemporary politics in the global north is, of course, populism. I mean, you can call it many different things, right-wing nationalism, whatever. But one of the constant themes, of course, is anti, if you will, social democratic governance, good governance of the sort that you study and I think you advocate in some way. They don't like bureaucrats telling you, to not use coal, not use oil, to recycle. They don't like it when they propose so-called progressive social changes, gender equality, ethno-racial equality. And so I wonder how, I mean, I'm not denying the importance of governance, but how the advocacy, if you will, of not just national, but transnational, precisely because populists are nationalists. And, Brexit is only one manifestation of that. How you think about the dynamic between these transnational forces and, well, inborn nationalism, which affects, I believe, everywhere, including, alas, Sweden.
Well, that's a very important and very complex question.
Yes. Well, you're so brilliant. I thought you could have insight.
I wouldn't aspire. But of course, one is forced to think about it, given the circumstances in which we live and conduct our work and research these days. And in my mind, populism lives off of people wanting to pick the lowest hanging fruits. To see what the advantage is or could be for them in the very near future, today, tomorrow. And so the future is somehow blocked out of sight. The long-term view is blocked out of sight by immediate returns. And this is a great challenge, I think, because what can we offer when there's so much uncertainty about the future? We don't really know. We cannot make promises that they will fare better in some years' time, or that their children or grandchildren will live in a more habitable planet. But that is a great challenge. So I think one of the big issues here is education. Raising awareness, and we all know this, of course, this is nothing new, but I still believe in it, that we need to work on this at a much more local and pragmatic and practical level. I think we also need to work on actually showing the implications of everyday decisions on the long term, because I think for most of us, this is a big unknown. Does it really matter if I leave the car at home and take my bike instead? What difference does it make? Because it actually does make a difference. And showing kind of the chains of implications that follow from the small scale everyday decisions, and to bring that into politics, I think, and to advocacy. And I think that also the transnational component could be strengthened by working on narrations that demonstrate, not just show and tell, but demonstrate how deeply interconnected we are across the globe. So it's not the case that we in certain parts of the world, Japan or Sweden, could shield ourselves off from the impacts of climate degradation in other parts of the world. It will affect us too, and pretty soon. So that's another kind of educational work that needs to be done. And also to show that everyday citizen actions actually do have implications in creating our societies, in having an impact. So the agency that I was talking about could be used to show that not only can I kind of dream about and possibly work in the direction of the future that I like, but actually instill a sense of agency that we together at the local level can actually work to create a future that is demonstrably better, even in the relatively short term. So there are linkages here in terms of the effects, the implications of decisions, etc., that need to be shown.
Could I interject at this point, because I found Professor Lee's comments about history, you know, the fact that the futurologists and people who are kind of interested and consider future studies very important, do not tend to be interested in history in the past. And I think the reverse could be said about historians not being interested in futures. And I think this is in some sense a case in point about how experts like us, you know, who are quite siloed into our own disciplines and our own disciplinary practices and sort of like preoccupations that need to be sort of dealt with in our own disciplines, simply are not either not interested, or even if they are interested, they feel the kind of obstacles of career progression as kind of coming in to obstruct any kind of thinking that goes beyond thinking outside of the box. And in fact, you know, I'm not plugging in for Tokyo College, but you kind of need a space to let this happen and to allow people to feel safe and secure about exploring things that they simply cannot ordinarily do. And so in that sense, I think it speaks a lot for kind of more sort of even more concerted effort than we've been having about sort of pushing for interdisciplinarity, people really talking outside of their disciplines, and historians, you know, whoever who study about the future should also so about the past should also be involved in thinking about the future, because I think, as you rightly say, John, that historians actually are sort of like the futurologists of the past, in that you study about the past knowing from the vantage point of the future, right? And that's, you know, and we historians often think that we shouldn't be doing this, you know, because we're actually trying to understand from the position of the past how it looked like. And of course, you got to do this, but also it's terribly important to understand the past and future from understanding the past's position. So that's, I think, one thing I wanted to add to this discussion. But another thing that I wanted to say was about this, you know, it also refers to Professor Lee's comment about, let's say, you know, has Japan dealt well with depopulation issues, which have been around. Everybody has known this for a long time in Japan, but have we actually dealt with it adequately? And so I kind of wondered that, you know, could it be the case that the sense of the depth of the sense of crisis we feel about a particular issue propels us to think much more seriously about a particular kind of future readiness? Because I was thinking about earthquake drill that we're about to have in about 20 minutes or something. But Japan has worked huge amounts on seismic, you know, seismology, and how to prevent or how to minimize destruction when earthquakes occur, because this is one thing. It's an uncertain thing, but you know, there's so many projections about so many percentage likelihood of this earthquake of this magnitude happening in, you know, next 30 years, next 20 years. And so we're kind of constantly living in this state of, in some sense, anxiety. And I, who's somebody who came from outside of Japan, I really feel this anxiety. I myself do. And I'm kind of really surprised how cool people are about this in Tokyo, in a metropolis like Tokyo, where you think if it happened, wow, the scale of destruction, everything is so vast, you know. And so one thing I would say is that Japan has been probably the most successful society in the world about future readiness to do with this particular issue, even though there are multiple other issues that actually haven't had the kind of level of attention and resources, you know, put in by the state in order to explore this. Okay, so I just wonder whether, unless, I don't know if you...
No,
Shall we, yes,
audience.
shall we go to the audience? So we have one question here from Trent Brown, a sociologist, and he says, could you comment on the ideological diversity of these future-oriented think tanks? Are they all about top-down governance, or are some more bottom-up, democratic and inclusive of marginal voices in exploring what a desirable future might look like?
Thank you, Trent, for that important question. It's also one that deserves a long answer, but I will give a short one here, even so. What we have focused on in this project is mostly corporate-funded think tanks, and think tanks that are, which may follow from this, interested in working to increase the chances of corporations to have a stronger say in different kinds of governance issues. So market-oriented think tanks. The exception here, and it's not again a think tank, is UNESCO. So let's keep this to the side. But furthermore, these think tanks are mostly US-based, with the exception of the World Economic Forum, which on the other hand then also aspires to have a global presence, being based in Switzerland, in Geneva. So they tend to be oriented towards competition and the enhancement of market dynamics, and generally not, at least not very vocally, interested in the representation of marginalized groups or vulnerable people. They tend to be oriented towards multi-stakeholder dialogue, meaning dialogue between corporations and civil society leaders and politicians and academics and so on. Again, emphasizing more the participation of leaders and the so-called ordinary citizen. Inclusiveness is, of course, I tend to say, on the agenda, but it does not mean that there is a representation of marginalized or vulnerable groups by definition in the meetings. Quite the contrary, I would say. So it tends to be, in the European sense, right-wing or liberal think tanks, in some cases even conservative, and lacking a leftist representation in our study base, as it were. That would, of course, be interesting to focus on, but the background for this project is that there is a lot of influential corporations, many of them transnational or European or US-based, that actually invest their money in these types of think tanks as advocacy organizations for their interests, hence the ideological bent in that direction. Thank you, Trent.
Okay, thank you very much. If there are any other questions, please don't hesitate to put it in the box. So I actually have a sort of, I don't know if it's a comment or a question, but this word anticipatory, is a very important term for these think tanks, and also for because they want to think about the future that they do not know, and they have to anticipate. But this is also the term that that excites a lot of creative people. You know, like in the creative arts, anticipatory sort of thinking or imagination leads to, you know, quite a lot of interesting developments in how artists come up with ideas about their work, and it's manifested in very different kinds of art. This could be painting, performance arts, installation art, and all sorts of things. So one thinking that I'm very interested in asking you about is, to what extent do these futures think tanks interested in collaborating really quite seriously with creative artists? And I know that you share the example of the musician in residence, and I think that's kind of I think that's probably a very interesting thing to do. But I think the creative people are really the people who think outside of the box, and we're just not tapping into their you know, to their sort of imaginary or imaginations and the way they kind of go around doing this, and also that it's partly probably because there's such a kind of deep kind of divide between the creative artist's output and what people in think tanks or in academia think of as sort of output, which is based on some kind of either theoretical or empirical foundations, you know. And so I don't know whether you came across this in your research.
Oh, thank you for that wonderful question. Yes, it is a compelling and intriguing word, and there is like a semiotic landscape in which this one exists, where we also find terms like imagination, aspiration, but also forecasting and projection. And so, I mean, it's a very interesting semiotic landscape in itself to think about and reflect upon what it means. And I think we have ample evidence to say that many think tanks tap into this. I mean, they are aware of the fact that artists and other creative workers have something to tell us, something to teach us about the capacity to aspire and to let loose, to get rid of ingrained ways of thinking and acting and doing things, and the power of art to relieve ourselves of these impeding structures, if you wish. And I think that's one motivation and rationale for actually bringing them into the process and attempting, I should say, to give them space and to have them work as guides in the process of anticipating plausible, desirable futures. And I think this is a good way to go forward, actually. But the darker side of it is that perhaps art is being instrumentalized and colonized in this sense. I mean, in some cases, simplified, definitely. So there are limits to what you can do even in a week-long course, not to mention in an afternoon session, which means that you get a very simple, not to say banal, idea of what art can do for your capacity to anticipate. And what is perhaps more problematic is that we see, in fact, experience ourselves as ethnographers, how one is in a weak place to actually use some of the artistic insights and capacities in these exercises, because it takes a while to learn the gaze and the modes of thinking, of acting, of a proper artist. So it's kind of a simplification process that is brought to bear on participants that then in the worst cases are made believe that they have this artistic capacity. I think we should be reminded of different forms of art as lengthy investments that take time, and we also need time to learn how to use those skills properly in anticipatory exercises.
If I could sort of add to what you've said, I think one of because I've actually been working with creative artists for a few years, and one of the most important lessons I learned was that they're not afraid of not knowing and not yet state.
Yes.
And they actually revel in that state because it really gives them so much freedom to think about anything. And I think it's sort of like what I was kind of hinting at was not so much that we actually try to kind of do what they do, because we all train differently. But I think having them help us to sort of liberate ourselves from our own kind of siloed knowledge basis might be a really sort of in a way it's actually very unsettling, because I felt, at my stage in career and age, I felt talking to artists that I simply felt really totally insecure about being a historian. I was so secure about. And so that sort of the foundational elements of what you kind of really build everything on gets kind of, can be really quite easily eradicated. And that's what I learned in this kind of process, that, wow, that thing that you really thought was really consolidated and firm actually can just fizzle away so quickly. And that sort of, but that also made me realize that we can actually think more freely than we do. And like it's just that we don't learn how to do that. Right? We learn more than anything else how to structure, shape knowledge, how to think about things that lead to certain ways. And anyway, it's just my sort of personal experience, but I found it extremely sort of kind of impactful in the way that I think of myself now as a scholar and historian and so forth. So I just wanted to throw that into this.
Yes, if I may comment, thank you very much. I think we're back in a sense from where you started in your comments in our why are we doing what we know is not working? I mean, we are trained in our silo disciplinary epistemic corridors in a sense, or whatever it is that we are trained in to think and act in a certain way, and it's hard to get out of those trenches. And indeed, we have a lot to learn from the unsettling practices of artists. And I have to say, as anthropologists and ethnographers, we are trained to expose ourselves to not knowing and to not being the one in charge. But even so, I think there are definitely limits to what we can take in. And I share with you the experience of having been, shaken up in my disciplinary knowledge and, the basic grounding, which I think is a good thing. And perhaps we need more of that. And in this way, let's come back to what you said about places like Tokyo College. I mean, places in the academic landscape, in the world of knowledge creation, where we can kind of meet across disciplines and across faculties to actually unsettle each other a bit and to ask very good questions. And I want to thank the two of you again for having done so.
Oh, thank you. So, John, I don't know if you have any last comments, or are you?
So there's a very interesting book by Kim Stanley Robinson, the science fiction writer, called The Ministry for the Future.
Yeah.
And I've always been puzzled why governments don't create something like that. Because it's coming.
Yeah. Are you saying that some kind of ministerial structure for the world?
In every national government, certainly, and transnational ones, certainly. I don't know, obviously you can't quite predict the future, but we know certain things are happening. And, I'm somewhat puzzled why we don't do more of it.
Yes, just a brief comment. We had for a few years Minister for Future Affairs in Sweden, but that was abandoned, unfortunately, I should say. And I do think that there are some smaller countries who actually have put that in place. But yes, we should reinsert it.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we have to close today a little bit early because of the future readiness.
Yes.
Earthquake drills, which is going to happen. So thank you very, very much to our panelists and to Professor GARSTEN for your most thought-provoking, I have to keep on saying this word, but a presentation, and for Professor Lee's really illuminating comments. So, and thank you very much to the audience for listening in and for the questions. Thank you.